morning, everyone, and welcome to the PivotBoss pre-market video for Thursday, October 23rd, 2025. I am Frank Ochoa, aka PivotBoss. Happy Thursday, everyone. Here's a look at the ES in the daily time frame. You can see the previous session here with a big time push to the downside, a break of the previous session's low, and a massive slide there. That was a big time drop. And from that drop, we got a bit of a bounce back to the midpoint of the day's range there. So a high range price action here with a downside move today. So far in pre-market trading, overnight trading, a little bit of a push up from those highs and then back down. And this thing is teetering right here on the 8-period average. This is very, very close to falling back into the range in a big way. The previous week's high right here already rejected, or at least a failure to hold above that level, which would open up a return back toward the previous session's midpoint if we continue to slide lower here, which would be right around that 66-67 zone. So we could be looking at a little bit more downside here into that zone down below, especially given how this market has played out so far to begin the week. If this becomes a lower high here, then we're likely pushing below the previous session's low and into that previous week's midpoint at the very least. Now we're still building out in this big old range here, and we could continue to see development within that range until we're ready for expansion. Which way are we going to go? As of right now, again, keeping an eye 67.50, the early resistance level and the previous week's high, for a shot at perhaps the previous week's midpoint. Looking at the NQ, narrow range days, the last few days heading into the RTH Open yesterday, beginning with a narrow range day inside the Tuesday range, and then all of a sudden big time expansion and a push down. That move down could be the initial wave that takes us lower. This is your previous week's high price right there, and we failed to hold that level yesterday. Now a rotation back into that area being defended here in overnight and pre-market trading. Now that could lead to the next push back down again. We could be looking at a push that takes us back to the previous week's midpoint, which is about 24,790. We were there yesterday basically. If we push through that midpoint here, that opens up the previous week's low, and that's where 24.4 comes into play. So we could be looking at quite the move down. Yesterday was a price discovery phase down. This could play out in a very similar way, especially if morning highs remain intact. Looking at crude oil, 5% higher. 5% higher heading into the RTH Open right now, and that's off the highs of the day of 62s. This has been a massive squeeze in development. Once this thing broke through 58s, it was a massive day up. The previous session, back-to-back squat bar days here, G-squat days. You also have a massive continuation here. This is a huge squeeze off the 56s back to 62s. That's a 6-point move here. We haven't seen that much strength in this market in a while. Like we've said before, when we have seen strength, even big one-day moves or multi-day moves, it's been followed by weakness. The 62s here is coming into that previous support. It's really 61.45 is this low here, and we're back to testing that level. Do we drop away from that level, or can we recover that level and open up the top end of the range back to 66s? So this is going to be an important zone right here. Do we fall away from this level, or can we continue higher into VWAP and the next highest market structure resistance zone? So 61.45 to 62 is that zone right here, but a massive push already heading into the RTH Open. Looking at gold futures, this one's up 1 1/3%. Big time drop a couple of days ago. Big time volatility we've seen here. The previous session we may have put in a low finally, and this is something we've talked about here. If we can find a low following this big impulse sell-off here, there may be a shot to bounce it back to the midpoint of that range. To get the midpoint of that range would get you a new large key range, and now that could set us up for development within that range for a while. So right now, can we find a way to bounce back up toward the midpoint of this zone here? I think it's somewhere around 42.42 might be that midpoint. but I'll have to check here just to make sure. But that zone up here could be in play for a new key range, and that key range would be a big key range to use for down the road action. All right, looking at the YM. YM right now down about 0.2%, very narrow range heading into the RTH open, just 24% of ADR. You can see right now an early thrust reversal developing here following the previous high range day down. That's following an overnight rejection, which doesn't look too bad here, but at the same time, a failure to hold 650 could really fail this pattern here, and you start to work your way down. Looking at the failure here yesterday out of the YM, it looked like a lower value relationship with a bearish bias, which means any pullback this morning could be sold for a continuation down. The pullback hasn't been as deep as, say, ES or NQ. Not that those were super deep. This just hasn't really had a pullback. We could see a little bit higher here after the RTH open, say above 800, and then that could still be sold for a continuation down into, say, 400. Today could be easily a 400-point day, easily, but maybe along the lines of 600 plus points, or it's been easily getting 500 plus points, but in this volatility moment we can get a super high range day, especially if we start to the downside. So we're looking for at least 400 to 500 points of range here. If you can find the morning high, you may have a good target down below, especially if these start to really work their way down. A failure of 600 here really opens up 400 and lower. All right, looking at Bitcoin, this one with a little bit of a bounce back. The previous session here just not able to find a failed new low. We were watching for a failed new low. It tried for multiple hours, but when they're trying for multiple hours at a previous low, it's not going to go. You want to see a decisive reaction early and a move away from that pivot throughout the rest of the session. We just didn't get that. Instead, price closed right at that previous low. We have lower highs now coming into play. This is looking pretty heavy on this right edge. After that sell-off, we were trying to see, can we get back up to the midpoint of that impulse move? That would tell us that we have a new key range. We could stay within the boundaries of that range, but failing to do so will put some stress on the lower edge of this range here, and we may see another round of weakness. So this is still a very important area of support here, but right now this market's still struggling to really find some lift off this zone. And if we fail here through the 107s, that could really open up another wave of weakness up ahead for Bitcoin. Looking at ETH, up 1.4%. Similar deal here yesterday. This thing failing to get a failed new low. Closed highly bearish, and the downtrend remains intact. Failed new high. The 8-period rolling over. Today with a little bit of a pullback, again like Bitcoin, but still within the framework of the downtrending bias here. And again, the inability to get back toward a midpoint here of this impulse move starts to put pressure on this lower edge, and that's when a failure can occur. So if we start to fail, that thing will really open up some downside. This is starting to get very important in here. Really need a decisive push. Really need to get back above that 4150. That opens up a new high, perhaps ahead, even if that new high gets rotated back down. So this is very important. Otherwise, a failure here, and you start to open up the potential for 2800 very quickly. All right, that is it for now. We'll see how this plays out here heading into the rest of the session. Good luck, trade well, and I'll see you in the trading room. Take care.